The crisp autumn air filled Mike's lungs as he moved quietly through the forest. Fallen leaves crunched softly beneath his boots despite his careful steps. He'd been hunting these woods since he was a boy, following in his father's footsteps just as his father had done before him. Today, the early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Mike paused, crouching down to examine fresh deer tracks in the soft earth. They headed east, away from the main trail and deeper into the woods. He smiled to himself. 20 years of hunting experience told him he was on the right path. Adjusting his orange vest and checking his rifle, he decided to follow the tracks. The forest grew denser as Mike ventured farther from the familiar paths. Towering pines blocked out more of the sunlight, and the underbrush thickened. He'd been walking for nearly an hour when something stopped him in his tracks. A sound, faint but distinct, caught his attention. He froze, listening intently. There it was again, a whimper, not the sound of any wild animal he recognized. Mike turned his head slowly, trying to pinpoint the direction. The sound came again, somewhere off to his right. Curious and concerned, he changed course, moving carefully through a patch of thick brambles toward the mysterious noise. "Hello," he called out softly, not wanting to startle whatever was making the sound. No response came except another whimper, this one sounding weaker than before. Pushing through a final stand of bushes, Mike stepped into a small clearing, and his heart dropped into his stomach. There, tied to a large oak tree with a frayed rope, was a dog. A German shepherd, its brown and black coat dirty and matted. The animal looked up at Mike with fearful eyes, attempting to back away, but stopped by the short length of rope. "Hey there, boy," Mike said gently, setting his rifle down against a nearby tree. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The dog responded with a low growl, baring its teeth slightly. But Mike could see the animal was terrified rather than aggressive. Its ribs showed clearly through its once thick coat, and an overturned metal bowl lay nearby, bone dry. "You've been out here a while, haven't you?" Mike whispered, his throat tightening with anger at whoever had left this animal to die. He slowly removed his backpack and took out his water canteen. The German shepherd watched his every move, muscles tense but too weak to put up much of a fight. Mike poured some water into his cupped hand and held it out, keeping his distance. "It's just water, buddy. You must be thirsty." For long moments, the dog simply stared, conflicted between fear and desperate thirst. Finally, hunger and dehydration won out. The animal inched forward as far as the rope would allow, stretching its neck to lap water from Mike's hand. "That's it," Mike encouraged, his voice warm with relief. "Easy now." He refilled his hand several times until the dog had drunk its fill. Then, moving with deliberate slowness, he unwrapped a sandwich from his pack, ham and cheese his wife had made that morning. Breaking off small pieces, he offered them to the increasingly trusting animal. As the dog ate, Mike examined the crude setup. The rope had rubbed the dog's neck raw in places. Nearby trees showed claw marks where the desperate animal had tried to reach food or water that had been just out of range. "Who would do this to you?" Mike murmured, anger building inside him. He noticed something glinting on the dog's collar, a worn leather band that had once been well cared for. Cautiously, Mike reached toward the dog's neck. The animal tensed, but allowed him to touch the collar. There, attached to the leather, was a small metal cylinder, the kind people sometimes used for identification tags. Mike's fingers trembled slightly as he unscrewed the tiny container. Inside was a folded piece of paper, weathered but still readable. As he unfolded the note and began to read, the expression on his face changed from confusion to disbelief. This wasn't a simple case of animal abandonment. This was something else entirely. Mike's hands shook slightly as he held the weathered note. The handwriting was uneven, like someone had written it while struggling to keep their hand steady. He squinted in the dappled forest light to make out the words. "To whoever finds Scout," the note began, "My name is Frank Harrison. I live alone in a cabin 3 miles northeast of here. I've fallen very ill and can't move well enough to get help. Scout is my only friend in the world, but I had to make the hardest choice of my life. I tied him near this trail hoping someone would find him and read this note. Please help us if you can. If not, please take care of Scout. He's a good boy." Mike read the note twice, his throat tightening. He looked at the German shepherd, who was watching him with tired but more trusting eyes after the food and water. "So your name is Scout," Mike said softly. The dog's ears perked up slightly at his name, confirming what the note had said. Mike glanced at his watch, 2:30 p.m. Daylight would only last a few more hours, and dark clouds were rolling in from the west. The temperature would drop fast once the sun disappeared behind the mountains. "All right, Scout, let's get you free from this tree, buddy." Mike pulled out his hunting knife and carefully approached the rope. Scout tensed but didn't growl this time. With a quick slice, the frayed rope fell away. Scout didn't bolt as Mike had half expected. Instead, the dog stood shakily, his legs weak from hunger and being tied up for who knows how long. He took a few uncertain steps, then looked back at Mike as if asking what to do next. "We need to find your owner, Scout. Can you show me the way home?" Mike knew the dog probably couldn't understand exactly what he was saying, but the gentle tone seemed to comfort Scout. Mike gathered his gear, tucking the note safely in his pocket. He offered Scout another piece of his sandwich, which the dog took more eagerly this time. Looking at the darkening sky, Mike felt a sense of urgency growing. If this Frank person had been unable to move for days, time might be running out. "Come on, boy, let's go." Mike started walking in the direction the note had indicated, northeast. To his surprise, Scout seemed to understand. The dog took a few limping steps, then paused and looked back at Mike, as if making sure he was following. As they walked, Scout gradually found more strength. Despite his weakness, the dog seemed determined, occasionally looking back to make sure Mike was still there. The forest grew thicker, with no clear trail to follow, but Scout moved with purpose, weaving between trees and pushing through underbrush. Light raindrops began to fall through the canopy. Mike pulled his jacket tighter and checked his compass to confirm they were still heading northeast. The temperature was dropping faster than he'd expected, and worry gnawed at him. If Frank had been alone and unable to move for days in this weather. After nearly an hour of difficult hiking, Scout suddenly picked up his pace. His tail, which had been hanging low, gave a slight wag. They crested a small hill, and through the trees, Mike spotted a small wooden cabin. Thin smoke rose from the chimney, a good sign someone was still alive inside. "Is that home, Scout?" Mike asked. The dog whined and moved faster toward the cabin, his purpose clear despite his weakened state. As they approached, Mike noticed the cabin looked well kept but isolated. No power lines ran to it, and there was no vehicle parked outside. The closest neighbor must be miles away. No wonder Frank had resorted to such a desperate measure to find help. Mike climbed the 3 wooden steps to the cabin's small porch, Scout right at his heels. He knocked firmly on the door. "Mr. Harrison? Frank? Are you in there? I found Scout and your note." No answer came, but Scout whined urgently, pawing at the door. Mike tried the handle. It turned easily. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, calling out again. "Hello? Anyone home? I'm here to help." What Mike saw as the door swung open made his blood run cold. The cabin door swung open with a long, low creak. The air inside was stale and heavy with the smell of burnt wood and something else, something that made Mike's heart race. Scout pushed past Mike's legs and disappeared into the dimly lit room. "Hello, Mr. Harrison?" Mike called again, stepping cautiously through the doorway. The cabin was a single room with a small kitchen area in one corner, a bed against the far wall, and a wood stove that glowed with dying embers. A kerosene lamp on the table provided the only light, its flame low and flickering. Scout whined loudly from the far side of the room. Mike followed the sound and found the dog nudging an elderly man who lay on the floor beside an overturned chair. The man wasn't moving. "Oh God," Mike whispered, rushing forward. He knelt beside the fallen man and gently rolled him onto his back. The man's face was pale and drawn, his breathing shallow. "Mr. Harrison? Frank, can you hear me?" Mike patted the man's cheek lightly. Frank's eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. Confusion clouded his gaze until he spotted Scout beside him. His cracked lips formed a weak smile. "Scout." His voice was barely a whisper. "You came back." "I found him tied to a tree with your note," Mike explained, helping Frank into a sitting position against the wall. "I'm Mike. I was hunting in the woods when I found Scout." Frank's weathered hand reached for his dog, and Scout pressed his head against the old man's palm. The simple reunion brought tears to Mike's eyes. "How long have you been down here?" Mike asked, looking around the cabin for water. 3, maybe 4 days, Frank said weakly. "My legs just gave out, couldn't get up." He coughed, the sound rattling in his chest. "Had to send Scout for help. Hardest thing I've ever done in my life." Mike found a cup and filled it with water from a container in the kitchen area. He helped Frank drink small sips. "You tied him to a tree," Mike said, trying to keep the judgment from his voice. Frank's eyes filled with tears. "Had to make sure he'd stay where people walk. If he just wandered, nobody would read the note." His hand trembled as he stroked Scout's head. "Broke my heart to leave him there. Didn't know if I'd ever see him again." Mike nodded, understanding the desperate logic. "Do you have any family we can call? Anyone who can help?" Frank shook his head. "Been alone since Martha passed 5 years ago. Nearest neighbor's about 6 miles down the mountain." Mike pulled out his cell phone but wasn't surprised to see no signal. He looked outside. The rain was falling steadily now, and daylight was fading fast. "I have a satellite phone in my truck," Mike said, "but it's parked about 2 hours from here." Frank coughed again, more violently this time. His face contorted with pain as he pressed a hand to his left side. "I don't think I can wait that long, son," Frank said. "Something's wrong inside. Feels like my whole left side is numb." Mike recognized the signs. His own grandfather had shown the same symptoms before his stroke 3 years ago. This wasn't just weakness from lying on the floor for days. Frank needed medical help immediately. "Do you have a working vehicle?" Mike asked urgently. Frank gestured weakly toward the back of the cabin. "Old pickup, hasn't been started in weeks. Keys are in my coat pocket." Mike found the keys and Frank's coat hanging by the door. "I'll check the truck. We need to get you to a hospital." Outside, the rain was coming down harder. Mike sprinted to the small shed behind the cabin where an ancient blue pickup truck sat covered in dust. He climbed inside, inserted the key, and said a silent prayer as he turned it. The engine sputtered, coughed, then died. Mike tried again. The starter whined but couldn't catch. One more try. Nothing. Mike slammed his palm against the steering wheel in frustration. The storm was worsening. Frank needed immediate medical attention, and they were miles from the nearest road. Back inside the cabin, Frank had somehow pulled himself to sit at the small table. Scout hadn't left his side. "Truck won't start," Mike said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Battery's dead." Frank nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this news. Figured as much. Mike paced the small cabin, thinking hard. "I could try to hike out and bring back help, but I don't want to leave you alone." Frank's eyes drifted to a shelf above his bed. "Top shelf. There's a flare gun. Only got 2 shots left. Save them for emergencies." Mike's eyes lit up. He grabbed the flare gun and checked it, old but functional, with 2 red flares. "There's a fire tower about a mile west of here," Frank said, his voice growing weaker. "Ranger checks it every few days. Might be our only chance." Mike looked from Frank to Scout and back to the storm outside. Night was falling, but he had to try. "I'll be back as soon as I can," Mike promised, zipping up his jacket. "Scout, stay with Frank. Take care of him." As if understanding perfectly, Scout lay down beside Frank's chair, resting his head on the old man's foot. Mike stepped out into the rain, flare gun clutched tightly in his hand. The fate of both man and dog now rested entirely on his shoulders. Rain pelted Mike's face as he pushed through the dense forest. The beam from his flashlight bounced wildly between trees, barely cutting through the darkness that had settled over the mountains. His boots sank into the muddy ground with each step, making progress slow and exhausting. 1 mile west, he muttered to himself, checking his compass again. The small device glowed faintly in his palm, the needle pointing steadily despite his shaking hands. Thunder rumbled overhead, and Mike quickened his pace. Every minute counted now. The image of Frank's pale face and Scout's worried eyes pushed him forward when his legs wanted to give up. 20 minutes into his journey, the trees began to thin and the ground sloped upward. Mike's lungs burned as he climbed the increasingly steep hill. The wind picked up, cutting through his wet jacket and chilling him to the bone. Finally, he reached a clearing at the top of the ridge. There, just visible through the rain, stood the fire tower, a tall wooden structure with a small cabin at the top, perched on stilts to provide a view over the surrounding forest. "Please be there," Mike whispered, approaching the base of the tower. No lights shone from the cabin above. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Hello." "Anybody up there?" "Emergency. Hello." Only the howling wind answered. Mike's heart sank. The ranger wasn't there. He looked at the flare gun in his hand, considering his options. If he fired it now and no one saw it, he'd waste one of his 2 chances. The rain suddenly intensified, and lightning flashed across the sky. In that brief moment of illumination, Mike spotted something, a small parked jeep partially hidden behind the tower. Someone was here after all. Mike rushed to the base of the tower and found the ladder leading up. The metal rungs were slippery from the rain, but he climbed as quickly as he dared. 50 feet up, his fingers numb from cold, he reached the small platform surrounding the cabin. He banged on the door with his fist. "Hello, I need help. Medical emergency." After a long moment, the door cracked open. A beam of light hit Mike's face, momentarily blinding him. "Who's there?" a gruff voice called out. "My name's Mike Perkins. I found an old man and his dog in a cabin about a mile east of here. The man needs medical help right away. I think he's had a stroke." The door opened wider, revealing a middle-aged man with a thick beard and a park ranger uniform. "Tom Wilson, Forest Service," the ranger said, ushering Mike inside the warm cabin. "Tell me exactly what's happening." Mike quickly explained finding Scout tied to the tree, the note, and Frank's condition at the cabin. As he spoke, Tom gathered equipment from around the small room. "Radio's been out because of the storm," Tom explained, pulling on a heavy raincoat. "But I've got a medical kit and a stretcher in the Jeep. My partner took our main vehicle down to the station this morning, so we'll have to make do with what we've got." Relief washed over Mike. "So you can help us?" Tom nodded, checking his watch. The road to the main highway is probably washed out by now, but there's an old logging road that should still be passable. It'll get us to the Northside Clinic in about an hour if we hurry. The 2 men hurried down the tower ladder and ran to Tom's Jeep. They loaded a portable stretcher and emergency kit into the back. "Lead the way," Tom said, pulling a poncho from the Jeep and handing it to Mike. "I've been stationed here 3 years, but still don't know all these back trails." The drive back to Frank's cabin was slow and treacherous. The Jeep's headlights revealed washouts and fallen branches across the narrow forest path. Twice they had to stop to clear debris from their route. Mike's mind raced ahead to the cabin. Had Frank's condition worsened? Was Scout keeping him company, or had the dog's instincts sent him searching for more help? After what felt like hours but was closer to 20 minutes, the cabin came into view. The kerosene lamp still glowed in the window, a beacon in the dark forest. "There," Mike pointed, relief in his voice. "We made it." But as they pulled up to the cabin, the door burst open. Scout ran out, barking frantically, his eyes wild with panic. "Something's wrong," Mike said, jumping from the Jeep before it fully stopped. "Hurry." With Tom close behind him, Mike rushed toward the cabin, his heart pounding with fear at what they might find inside. Mike burst through the cabin door with Scout leading the way, his heart hammering against his ribs. The kerosene lamp still flickered on the table, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Frank was no longer sitting in the chair where Mike had left him, but was sprawled on the floor, one arm outstretched as if he had tried to reach for something. "Frank!" Mike dropped to his knees beside the old man. Frank's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. Tom rushed in behind him, medical kit already open. "How long has he been like this?" "I don't know. He was conscious when I left," Mike said, his voice tight with worry. He gently lifted Frank's head, cradling it off the hard floor. Scout whined and licked Frank's hand, his tail low and movements anxious. The dog had clearly been trying to wake his owner before running outside for help when he heard the Jeep approach. Tom checked Frank's pulse, his expression grim. Pulse is weak and irregular, pupils uneven. He looked up at Mike. Classic signs of a stroke. "We need to move him now." Together, they carefully lifted Frank onto the stretcher Tom had brought. The old man groaned softly but didn't open his eyes. "Talk to him," Tom instructed as he secured straps across Frank's body. "Keep him connected to us if you can." Mike leaned close to Frank's ear. "Frank, it's Mike. We're going to get you to a doctor. Scout's here too. He's not leaving your side." At the mention of Scout's name, Frank's eyelids fluttered. His lips moved silently. "That's it," Mike encouraged. "Stay with us. Scout needs you to fight." As if understanding, Scout pressed his nose against Frank's hand again. "We need to keep him warm," Tom said, grabbing blankets from the bed. "Temperature's dropping fast and shock is a real concern." They wrapped Frank in layers of blankets, working quickly but gently. Outside, the rain had become a downpour, drumming against the cabin roof like thousands of impatient fingers. "Road's getting worse by the minute," Tom said, glancing out the window. "We've got to move now, or we might not make it out at all." Mike nodded and looked around the small cabin. "Should we bring anything for him? Medications? ID?" Tom was already checking the shelf above Frank's bed. "Got his wallet and what looks like prescription bottles. I'll bring them all." Mike noticed a framed photograph on the bedside table. A younger Frank in military fatigues, standing beside a smiling woman. He grabbed it and tucked it into his jacket. Something told him Frank would want it with him. Together, they lifted the stretcher and carefully maneuvered through the narrow doorway. Scout followed closely, refusing to be separated from his owner. The rain hit them like a cold shower as they stepped outside. Wind whipped through the trees, bending branches and sending leaves swirling around them. "The Jeep's just 10 feet away," Tom shouted over the storm. "Watch your footing." They slipped and struggled across the muddy ground, trying to keep the stretcher level. Frank moaned as they jostled him, his face contorting with pain. Almost there, Mike assured him that he wasn't sure Frank could hear him over the roaring wind. With great effort, they slid the stretcher into the back of the Jeep. Mike climbed in beside Frank while Tom hurried to the driver's seat. "What about Scout?" Mike called out. The dog was already trying to jump into the crowded back of the Jeep, unwilling to be left behind. "Bring him," Tom yelled back. No time to argue with a determined dog. Mike helped Scout up, and the dog immediately settled beside Frank's stretcher, resting his head on the blanket near Frank's chest. Tom started the engine and threw the Jeep into gear. The tires spun in the mud before gaining traction. They lurched forward down the narrow trail that had become a muddy stream in the downpour. "Northside Clinic is 20 miles away," Tom called over his shoulder. "Road's bad, but I know these mountains. We'll make it." Mike held onto the stretcher with one hand to steady it against the bouncing ride. With his other hand, he gripped Frank's cold fingers. The old man's breathing seemed more labored now, each breath a visible struggle. "Stay with us, Frank," Mike whispered, leaning close. "You've got people waiting for you now. You're not alone anymore." Through the back window of the Jeep, the small cabin disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the storm and the night. The Jeep's headlights cut through sheets of rain as Tom navigated the treacherous mountain road. Each bump and turn sent jolts through the vehicle, forcing Mike to brace himself while keeping Frank stable on the stretcher. "How's he doing back there?" Tom called over his shoulder, eyes fixed on the muddy path ahead. Mike checked Frank's pulse again. "Still with us, but breathing's getting more labored." He looked down at Scout, who hadn't moved from his position beside his owner. The dog's eyes were fixed on Frank's face, as if willing him to stay alive through sheer devotion. Suddenly, the Jeep's front wheels slid sideways. Tom wrestled with the steering wheel, fighting to keep them on the narrow road as mud and water rushed across their path. "Wash out ahead," Tom shouted, slowing the vehicle. "We need to find another way around." Mike's stomach knotted with fear. Every minute counted now. He glanced at Frank's ashen face, the old man's lips taking on a bluish tint. Tom stopped the Jeep and pulled out a weatherproof map. He studied it by flashlight, water dripping from his hat onto the paper. "There's an old fire road that connects about half a mile back. It'll add 20 minutes to our trip, but it might be the only option." "Whatever it takes," Mike said, "just get us there." Tom turned the Jeep around carefully on the narrow road, the tires spinning before catching hold. They backtracked until Tom spotted the nearly hidden turnoff. "Hold on tight," he warned as they turned onto a path that was little more than 2 tire tracks through dense underbrush. The Jeep bounced violently as they navigated the overgrown fire road. Low-hanging branches scraped against the windows, and the headlights revealed a rough path barely wide enough for the vehicle. In the back, Mike did his best to shield Frank from the worst of the jostling. Scout whined as he was thrown against the side of the Jeep, but quickly returned to his position by Frank's side. Talk to him, Tom advised, eyes still on the difficult road. Keep his mind engaged if you can. Mike leaned close to Frank's ear. Hey, Frank, we're getting you help. Scout's right here with you. He paused, searching for words that might reach through the old man's semi-conscious state. You know, when I first found Scout tied to that tree, I was so angry at whoever left him there. I didn't understand. But now I do. You made an impossible choice to try to save both of you. Frank's eyelids fluttered slightly, and his lips moved without sound. That's right, Mike encouraged. You're a fighter. You survived who knows what in your military days. You can survive this too. As if responding to Mike's words, Frank's hand twitched, his fingers seeking something. Scout immediately nuzzled closer, and Frank's fingers found the dog's fur. Look at that, Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. Scout's not going anywhere. He's got your back. Tom called from the front seat. We're back on the main road. Should be smoother from here. The Jeep picked up speed as they hit asphalt. Through the rain-streaked windows, Mike could make out distant lights. Civilization at last. How much further? He asked. 10 minutes if the road stays clear, Tom replied, pushing the Jeep as fast as he dared in the treacherous conditions. Frank suddenly made a choking sound, his body stiffening on the stretcher. He's seizing, Mike shouted, remembering his first aid training. We need to get there now. Tom pressed harder on the accelerator, the Jeep's engine roaring as they sped toward the lights of the small mountain town. The next few minutes passed in a blur of rain, headlights, and fear. Finally, a small building with a red emergency sign came into view. Almost there, Frank, Mike said urgently. Don't give up now. You've got people waiting for you. You've got Scout. The Jeep skidded to a stop at the clinic's emergency entrance. Tom was already out the door, running inside for help. Within seconds, he returned with 2 nurses and a doctor, all rushing through the rain with a proper gurney. Suspected stroke victim, Tom explained as they carefully transferred Frank from the stretcher. Found in a remote cabin, probably been down for nearly 4 days. Scout tried to follow as they wheeled Frank inside, but one of the nurses stopped him. No dogs allowed in the treatment area, sir. Mike saw the panic in Scout's eyes and quickly knelt beside him. It's okay, boy. They're going to help him. We'll wait right here. As the doors closed behind Frank and the medical team, Mike sat on the wet ground beside Scout, his arm around the faithful dog. They were both soaked to the bone, exhausted and afraid, but they had done everything possible to save a man who had been a stranger to Mike just hours before. He's going to make it, Mike told Scout, hoping it wasn't a lie. He has to. Morning light streamed through the clinic windows, replacing the storm's darkness with gentle warmth. Mike sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his hunting clothes still damp and his eyes heavy from a sleepless night. Scout lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head whenever the door to the treatment area opened. A nurse with kind eyes approached them, a paper cup of coffee in her hand. Thought you could use this, she said, offering it to Mike. Thanks, he said gratefully, taking the steaming cup. Any news? She nodded. Doctor will be out soon to talk to you. But I can tell you he's stable now. Mike let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He's going to make it. It was touch and go for a while, but yes, she smiled. He's tough, that one. As if understanding her words, Scout's tail thumped against the floor. The clinic door opened, and Tom the Ranger walked in, carrying a bag of breakfast sandwiches. Brought you something to eat, he said, sitting beside Mike. Any updates? Before Mike could answer, a doctor in a white coat appeared. His face showed fatigue, but there was a hint of satisfaction in his expression. You must be the hunters who brought in Mr. Harrison, he said. Mike stood quickly. Yes. How is he? He suffered a significant stroke, but we were able to administer treatment in time, the doctor explained. Another few hours and it would have been a different story. You saved his life. Relief washed over Mike. Can we see him? The doctor hesitated, looking down at Scout. We don't usually allow animals in patient rooms. That dog is the reason Frank's alive, Tom interrupted. If he hadn't been willing to be separated from his owner to get help, nobody would have found them. The doctor considered this, then nodded. All right, 5 minutes and the dog stays off the bed. They followed him through double doors into a small room where Frank lay connected to various monitors. His face had regained some color, and his eyes were open though tired. "Frank," Mike said softly, "it's Mike and Scout. We made it." Frank's eyes lit up at the sight of them. He tried to speak, but the words came out slurred. "My boy," he managed, his gaze fixed on Scout. Scout whined and stood on his hind legs, front paws on the edge of the bed, careful not to climb up. Frank slowly raised a trembling hand to touch his dog's head. "The doctor says you're going to be okay," Mike said, blinking back unexpected tears. "You just need some time to recover." Frank nodded weakly. "Thanks to you," he whispered with effort. "I've got a question that's been bothering me," Mike said gently. "When you're feeling better, where will you go? That cabin's too isolated for someone recovering from a stroke." Frank's face fell. "Don't know," he admitted. "No family left. Just Scout." Mike looked at the faithful dog, then back at Frank. The idea had been forming in his mind all night. "My wife and I have a guest house on our property. It used to be my workshop, but we fixed it up last year. It's not big, but it's all on one level, perfect for someone who needs to take it easy." Frank's eyes widened. "You'd do that? For a stranger?" Mike smiled. "You're not a stranger anymore. Besides, my wife Lisa loves dogs. She's wanted one for years, but I'm always too busy hunting. She'd be thrilled to have Scout around." Tears welled in Frank's eyes. He reached for Mike's hand and squeezed it with surprising strength. "Why?" he asked simply. "Sometimes the best things in life come from unexpected places," Mike said. "A week ago, I went hunting expecting to bring home a deer. Instead, I found something more valuable: 2 new friends." 6 months later, Frank sat on the porch of Mike's guest house, watching Scout and Mike's young daughter play fetch in the yard. His speech had improved with therapy, and though he walked with a cane, he was regaining his independence day by day. "Coffee?" Lisa asked, stepping onto the porch with 2 steaming mugs. "Thanks," Frank said, accepting the cup with a steady hand, a small victory. From inside the house, Mike called out, "Frank, come look at these fishing lures I found at the store. Bet they'd work great at Wilson's Creek." Frank smiled, watching Scout bound back toward the porch, tennis ball in mouth, tail wagging wildly. The dog dropped the ball at his feet, eyes bright with joy. "Good boy, Scout," Frank said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You found us a home after all."